Lord Blackstone speaks.
By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything, and is therefore called in our law French a femme couverte. Femina viro coperta is said to be covert baron, or under the protection and influence of her husband, her baron or lord, and her condition during her marriage is called her coverture. Upon this principle of a union of person and husband and wife depend almost all the legal rights, duties, and disabilities that either of them acquire by the marriage. I speak not at present of the rights of property, but of such as are merely personal.
Merely personal? What year was this?
1765.
Huh.
In 1765, in Blackstone's world, there is order, a strict social order of monarch, aristocracy, and land. And this order places women firmly under the control, first of their fathers and later their husbands. If a woman was so unfortunate as to never marry, why then she was passed along to brothers, uncles, or cousins.
And these were the privileged women, mind you.
Yes, a well-ordered world is a fine thing.
But in July of 1789, a group of not-so-privileged Frenchmen stormed an underutilized civic building in the heart of Paris.
At the time, there were exactly 7 prisoners being held in the Bastille, but it stood as a symbol of the monarch's abuse of power.
And that was the spark that lit the fuse of the French Revolution.
Meanwhile, back in Great Britain, thinking men have to decide how they feel about such a challenge to order.
Edmund Burke responded with an open letter which becomes a best-selling pamphlet, Reflections on the Revolution in France.
I do not like change.
Well, who could blame him?
I rise to the defense of monarchy, of aristocracy, of property, of hereditary succession, and the wisdom of the ages. I do not like abstract thinking. Freedom and equality are different. Genuine equality must be judged by God. Liberty is a construct of the law, and no excuse to do whatever one would like. When men play God, presently they act like devils.
That was the opening salvo. What followed was 6 years of pamphlet wars.
There is pretty good money in political controversy, if you can stir it up.
Known as the Revolution controversy. The first response was an anonymous pamphlet called Rights of Men, published just 6 weeks after Burke's reflections defended the aristocracy and the old order.
Rights cannot be based on tradition. Rights should be conferred because they are reasonable and just, no matter their basis in tradition.
The author of this fiery piece is a young woman who advocates for reason.
It is the 18th century.
Her name is Mary Wollstonecraft, and she has no father to care for her.
Well, she has a father, but he's an alcoholic, and she is taking care of him.
What she does have is a brain, fertile with ideas, and a passionate belief in reason, in reasoning, and in liberty.
As to Edmund Burke, the whole tenor of his plausible arguments settles slavery on an everlasting foundation, allowing his servile reverence for antiquity and prudent attention to self-interest to have the force which he insists on. The slave trade ought never be abolished. And because our ignorant forefathers, not understanding the native dignity of man, sanctioned a traffic that outrages every suggestion of reason and religion, we are to submit to the inhuman custom and term an atrocious insult to humanity the love of our country and a proper submission to the laws by which our property is secured. Security of property. Behold, in a few words, the definition of English liberty, and to this selfish principle, every nobler one is sacrificed.
But another voice weighs in.
Let us nurture and raise up females not to aspire to advantages which the Constitution denies them, but to know and appreciate those which it guarantees them.
Guaranteed rights?
Don't get excited. This is France in 1790. The speaker is Maurice Talleyrand.
Men are destined to live on the stage of the world. A public education suits them. It early places before their eyes all the scenes of life. Only the proportions are different. The paternal home is better for the education of women. They have less need to learn to deal with the interests of others than to accustom themselves to a calm and secluded life.
You can imagine how Mary Wollstonecraft felt about that. This time, her pamphlet is entitled A Vindication of the Rights of Women.
Liberty is the mother of virtue. And if women be, by their very constitution, slaves, and not allowed to breathe the sharp, invigorating air of freedom, they must ever languish like exotics, and be reckoned beautiful flaws of nature.
What she saw was a future when women could pursue virtually any career opportunity.
Though I consider that women in the common walks of life are called to fulfill the duties of wives and mothers by religion and reason, I cannot help lamenting that women of a superior caste have not a road open by which they can pursue a more extensive plans of usefulness and independence. How many women waste life away the prey of discontent, who might have practiced as physicians, regulated a farm, managed a shop, and stood erect, supported by their own industry, instead of hanging their heads surcharged with the dew of sensibility.
How many women?
Who knows? But maybe a better question is, why aren't there more? Why aren't more demanding more?
Mary has an answer.
I attribute these problems to a false system of education, gathered from books written on the subject by men who, considering females rather as women than human creatures, have been more anxious to make them alluring mistresses than affectionate wives and mothers.
What else would they do?
I shall first consider women in the grand light of human creatures, who, in common with men, are placed on earth to unfold their faculties.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic,
The year is 1776. John Adams is in Philadelphia discussing inalienable rights. His wife, Abigail, reminds her husband,
Remember the ladies.
but John Adams says to that,
"We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Women have no need of political power. They sculpt the future by acting as a positive moral influence on husbands and raising virtuous sons."
Humph.
they did not remember the ladies.
Women could not vote.
Many men couldn't either.
Right. In many states, only property owners could vote.
Which of course just neatly avoids the question of women voting, since women couldn't legally own property.
Oh,
Remember Blackstone's coverture? That delightful concept had made its way across the ocean, and the women of the new country were passed, like their European counterparts, from father to husband.
You won't be surprised to learn that in the new United States, Mary Wollstonecraft had fellow thinkers, including the brilliant Margaret Fuller.
We need to hear the excuses men make to themselves for their worthlessness.
I like this woman.
Fuller was part of the American transcendental movement. Amazingly, this woman was the editor of the Dial magazine, which was the journal for the transcendentalist movement.
Then the writers she published would gather in her parlor in Boston, fine-tuning their thoughts, which would then become the next article. In 1845, Fuller herself published an essay entitled Women in the 19th Century.
It should be remarked that as the principle of liberty is better understood and more nobly interpreted, a broader protest is made on behalf of women. As men become aware that few men have had a fair chance, they are inclined to say that no women have had a fair chance.
Boom!
Women must fulfill themselves as individuals, not subordinates to men. We would have every arbitrary barrier thrown down. We would have every path laid open to women as freely as to man. And then, and only then, will mankind be ripe for this, when inward and outward freedom for woman as much as for man shall be acknowledged as a right, not yielded as concession.
Fuller envisioned an infinity of choices for women.
If you ask me what office woman may fill, I will reply, any. I do not care what case you put. Let them be sea captains, if you will. And can we wonder that many reformers think that measures are not likely to be taken on behalf of women unless their wishes could be publicly represented by women?
There, she said it.
Of course, Fuller was not alone in her views or her aspirations.
And the idea of rights for women was not the only big idea facing the young country. The reform movement was in full flower.
The idea of temperance was often promoted by the same groups promoting women's rights.
Temperance. You mean like prohibition, no alcohol?
Well, at the beginning, they advocated for reduced alcohol. Later, prohibition became the goal. You see, as the new country became more and more prosperous, Americans moved from beer and hard cider to whiskey and rum.
And rum was part and parcel to the slave trade. It was slave labor that made rum affordable.
And cheap hard liquor created alcoholics, or at least abusive drunks.
Fearful quarrels and brutal violence are the national consequence of the frequent use of the bottle.
And of course, women were still in coverture to their husbands, so they had no property of their own and no way to escape an abusive situation.
Right. So these two radical ideas, women's suffrage and temperance, were attached to the most divisive idea of all, the abolition of slavery.
But what I don't understand is, how can anyone defend slavery?
Well, through history, there are a lot of arguments. Some people are natural slaves. They're inferior and their suffering is just like that of, say, dumb animals.
What?
I didn't say they were good arguments. Sometimes slavery was justified because the masters treated their slaves well.
Right.
The idea was that slavery was better than starving.
Those are the only choices?
Okay, sure. But the real argument that carried the day in the U.S. was money.
Of course.
Our agrarian economy will collapse without slave labor.
Slavery had been outlawed in Great Britain in 1834, But in the United States, it was still a live question, passionately debated by both men and women.
Open debate. Even the concept of free speech for men was not universally accepted, especially when it had to do with slavery. In fact, here in the land of the free, there was a gag rule that kept lawmakers from speaking out against slavery when Congress was in session.
Women were especially active in the movement for the abolition of slavery.
True. African American abolitionist and former slave, Frederick Douglass, acknowledged the relationship between the anti-slavery movement and the suffragists.
When the true history of the anti-slavery cause shall be written, women will occupy a large space in its pages.
But for many, women speaking out in public, no matter the cause, was as radical an idea as, say, educating women.
Reverend Albert Folsom, pastor of the Universalist Church in Hingham, Massachusetts, objected to women speaking before mixed audiences of men and women.
If it is not permitted unto woman to speak publicly upon the subject of religion, it verily is not part of their right to be heard upon the subject of slavery. If it is a shame for a woman to speak in the church, it is no less shameful for her to raise her voice upon any other theme. Hence, they ought to be looked upon as busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. It is unbecoming the dignity of the feminine class of society to importune the national court year after year upon the difficult subject of slavery.
But women continued to speak. One of the most compelling public speakers was a young Quaker wife, mother, and minister, Lucretia Mott.
I have no idea of submitting tamely to injustice inflicted either on me or on the slave. I will oppose it with all the moral powers with which I am endowed. I am no advocate of passivity.
Mott, the only daughter in a reform-minded Quaker family, was raised to embrace the Quaker tenet that all were equal in the eyes of God, and it was in the Quaker meeting house that she often spoke.
The laws given on Mount Sinai for the government of man and woman were equal. The precepts of Jesus make no distinction. Those who read the scriptures and judge for themselves, not resting satisfied with a perverted application of the text, do not find the distinction that theology and ecclesiastical authorities have made in the condition of the sexes.
Her first job was as an assistant teacher at the Nine Partners Quaker School in Dutchess County, New York. Her future husband, social reformer James Mott, was also an assistant teacher there. It was seeing his paycheck in contrast with her own that led to a startling controversy.
The charge for the education of girls was the same as that for boys. Yet, when the girls became teachers, as women, they received but half as much pay as men for their services. The injustice of this was so apparent that I early resolved to claim for my sex all that an impartial creator has bestowed.
During her time at the Nine Partners Quaker School, Mott became friends with the reformer and abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. When Garrison founded the American Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia, Mott founded the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, a group that unwittingly set off a controversy within the abolitionist community.
Although no one doubted the strength of her commitment to end slavery, many male abolitionists objected to Mrs. Mott, a woman, entering politics.
No, that's not quite right. They objected to her speaking in public on political questions.
Ultimately, this divisive issue,
Women speaking in public,
fractured the American Anti-Slavery Society. In 1840, William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of the anti-slavery newspaper The Liberator, argued that women should be allowed to be members.
Happy to have the dues money, I expect.
The group split, and when the World Anti-Slavery Conference was held in London that year, 5 of the delegates from Garrison's wing of the group were women, including Lucretia Mott.
Of course, once they got to London, the women were forbidden to speak. They spent their time seething in the visitors' gallery.
One of the delegates, a New Yorker named Henry Brewster Stanton, brought along his new bride, the former Elizabeth Cady.
Oh, a European honeymoon!
Well, forced to sit silent in the gallery, Mrs. Stanton and Mrs. Mott formed a close friendship through common frustrations and goals.
Apparently, there was plenty of time in that gallery and on the sea voyage home to dream and even conspire about a different future.
Once they got home, the 2 women continued their work for abolition and temperance and cared for their growing families.
They had 13 children between them.
And despite husbands and children, Mrs. Mott continued to speak and continued to write. Often Elizabeth Cady Stanton's words were delivered by Lucretia Mott as she spoke throughout New England.
But in 1847, the Stantons returned to New York for family support. Henry Stanton's health had collapsed, so they moved to Seneca Falls.
In June, in the summer of 1848, Mrs. Mott had plans to visit Mrs. Stanton in Seneca Falls. Neither of them had ever forgotten their discussions on the trip home from London nearly 10 years before. At an afternoon tea party, the 2 friends and 3 other tea sippers decided to call a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious conditions and rights of women.
On July 19, 1848, less than a week after Mrs. Stanton and Mrs. Mott announced their convention, about 250 women and 40 men assembled at the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Seneca Falls, New York.
Even at this women's rights meeting, it was unthinkable for a woman to act as chairperson. Lucretia Mott's husband was scheduled to take on that role. On the first day of the convention, he was apparently too ill to attend.
Ill.
Mrs. Stanton's husband had ducked out of town for a few days. He was apprehensive about his wife's apparent intent to call for female suffrage.
A cousin of Elizabeth Cady Stanton named Gerrit Smith was running for office as a Liberty Party candidate, and he'd actually called for votes for women earlier in the summer. And that inspired Mrs. Stanton to make women's suffrage one of the proposals to be brought before the convention. But even the redoubtable Lucretia Mott was apprehensive about that.
But Lizzie, they will think us mad.
The Wesleyan Church was chosen as the site for the convention. For the first day, only women were scheduled to participate in the discussion. But when Stanton and Mott arrived, both women and men were waiting on the church steps. Unfortunately, no one had remembered to make arrangements for the building to be unlocked. With several hundred people milling around, Elizabeth Stanton solved the problem by lifting her 9-year-old nephew through the window and directing him to open the door.
The waiting crowd streamed into the church. When Stanton herself walked in, she found both men and women seated, despite the original plan.
The men were told that their voices were not needed this first day.
There were 11 proposals on the agenda for the convention to take up. Lucretia Mott was to be the featured speaker, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had composed those proposed resolutions, was the first to speak.
We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, only to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and even imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in the case of separation, the children of her love. Laws which make her the mere dependent on his bounty. It is to protest against such unjust laws as these that we are assembled today, and to have them forever erased from our statute books, deeming them a shame and a disgrace to a Christian republic in the 19th century. We have met to uplift woman's fallen divinity upon an even pedestal with man's. And, strange though it may seem to many, we now demand our right to vote according to the declaration of the government under which we live.
Declaration of the government.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal.
This right no one pretends to deny. We need not prove ourselves equal to Daniel Webster to enjoy this privilege, for the ignorant Irishman in the ditch has all the civil rights he has. We need not prove our muscular power equal to this same Irishman, for the most tiny, weak, ill-shaped stripling of 21 has all the civil rights of the Irishman. We hold no objection to discussing the question of equality, for we feel the weight of argument lies wholly with us. But we wish the question of equality kept distinct from the question of rights, for the proof of the one does not determine the truth of the other. All white men in this country have the same rights, however they may differ in mind, body, or estate. The right is ours. The question now is, how shall we get possession of what rightfully belongs to us? To have drunkards, idiots, horse-racing, rum-selling rowdies, and silly boys fully recognized, while we ourselves are thrust out from all the rights that belong to citizens, is too grossly insulting to the dignity of women to any longer be quietly submitted to. The right is ours. Have it we must. Use it we will. The pens, the tongues, the fortunes, the indomitable wills of many women are already pledged to secure this right. The great truth that no just government can be formed without the consent of the governed, we shall echo and re-echo in the ears of the unjust judge, until, by continual coming, we shall weary him.
For 2 days, each of the 11 propositions was debated. This included Elizabeth Cady Stanton's call for female suffrage. Frederick Douglass, the sole African-American attendee, rose to speak in favor.
As a black man, I cannot accept the right to vote if a woman cannot also claim that right. The world would be a better place if women were involved in the political sphere. In this denial of the right to participate in government, not merely the degradation of woman and the perpetuation of a great injustice happens, but the maiming and repudiation of one half of the moral and intellectual power of the government of the world.
For many in the building, Douglass's powerful words rang true. The resolution passed by a large majority. The featured speaker, Lucretia Mott, spoke to end the session.
Let women then go on, not asking his favor, but claiming as right the removal of all the hindrances to her elevation in the scale of being. Let her receive encouragement for the proper cultivation of all her powers, so that she may enter profitably into the active business of life, employing her own hands, in ministering to her necessities, strengthening her physical being by proper exercise and observance of the laws of health. Let her not be ambitious to display a fair hand, and to promenade of fashionable streets of our city, but rather, coveting earnestly the best gifts, let her strive to occupy such walks in society as will befit her true dignity in all the relations of life. No fear that she will then transcend the proper limits of female delicacy. True modesty will be as fully preserved in acting out those important vocations to which she may be called, as in the nursery or at the fireside, ministering to man's self-indulgence. Then, in the marriage union, the independence of the husband and wife will be equal, their dependence mutual, and their obligations reciprocal. In conclusion, let me say, credit not the old-fashioned absurdity that woman is a secondary lot, ministering to the necessities of her lord and master. It is a higher destiny I would award you. If your immortality is as complete, and your gift of mind as capable as ours of increase and elevation, I would put no wisdom of mine against God's evident allotment. I would charge you to water the undying bud and give it healthy culture and open its beauty to the sun. And then you may hope that when your life is bound up with another, you will go on equally and in fellowship that shall pervade every earthly interest.
At least 32 men signed the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances. Among those men was Frederick Douglass, the former slave who was then publishing his own abolitionist newspaper in nearby Rochester. Douglass wrote an account of the proceedings in his North Star.
His opinion as the editor of such a prominent newspaper carried weight, and he stated the position of the North Star explicitly.
We hold woman to be justly entitled to all we claim for man.
This letter, written a week after the convention, reaffirmed the first part of the paper's slogan, "Right is of no sex."
His friends in Rochester held their own convention 2 weeks later. They enthusiastically added their signatures to the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances.
Douglass was a powerful writer, as well as an inspirational speaker. His own personal experiences as a slave made him most effective in his ability to convey the evils of slavery and the value of freedom. Douglass had escaped from from captivity working near the city of Baltimore. He dressed as a sailor and carried false paperwork identifying him as a free man. And then he simply got on a train and made his way to New York City. The entire escape took less than 24 hours.
I have often been asked how I felt when first I found myself on free soil, and my readers may share the same curiosity. There is scarcely anything in my experience about which I could give a more satisfactory answer. A new world had opened up upon me. If life is more than breath and the quick round of blood, I lived more in one day than in a year of my slave life. It was a time of joyous excitement, which words can but tamely describe. In a letter written to a friend soon after reaching New York, I said, "I felt as one might feel upon escape from a den of hungry lions." Anguish and grief, like darkness and rain, may be depicted, but gladness and joy, like the rainbow, defy the skill of pen or pencil.
He was also an equally powerful orator, and often Douglass's host on speaking and fundraising trips was a New York farmer named Anthony.
Farmer Anthony had been a Quaker minister until his congregation turned him out for renting the meeting house to a dancing school.
Now, Mr. Anthony had a daughter, Susan, who was teaching school at the Kanakahari Academy. Susan Anthony was dismayed to learn that she did not receive pay equal to the male teachers who were doing the same work. Immediately upon this realization, she quit the job.
That sounds familiar.
She returned home to her father's farm. It was there that she met Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. And encouraged by Douglass and Garrison, she worked for abolition. She was also the organizer and president of the Daughters of Temperance.
Temperance again.
Quaker meetings in towns all across New York invited her to speak.
She arrived at the New York State Convention for the Sons of Temperance, expecting to speak. But she was stopped as she approached the podium.
Because she was a woman.
In that same year, a petition for prohibition had been presented to the New York State Legislature. The legislators, all men, refused to consider it because the majority of the 28,000 plus signatures were those of women and children.
Which sort of makes sense, since women and children were the victims of the alcohol-induced violence that the temperance reformers were trying to prevent.
From that point on, Susan B. Anthony vowed to work for equal rights for women in all things.
And she never worked at a regular job again, making her entire income from public speaking.
Oh, the irony.
In 1856, Anthony became an agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society.
As an agent, she would arrange meetings, make speeches, put up posters, and distribute leaflets.
And as she did so, she encountered hostile mobs, armed threats, and had things thrown at her.
She was hung in effigy.
In Syracuse, her image was dragged through the streets.
Susan B. Anthony was both famous and infamous.
In 1863, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the Women's National Loyal League to support and petition for the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery.
They went on to campaign for full citizenship for women and people of any race, including the right to vote in the 14th and 15th Amendments.
But they were bitterly disappointed and disillusioned when women were excluded.
I urge a 16th Amendment because manhood suffrage, or a man's government, is civil, religious, and social disorganization. The male element is a destructive force, stern, selfish, and self-aggrandizing, loving war, violence, conquest, and acquisition, breeding disorder, discord, disease, and death. See what a record of blood and cruelty the pages of history reveal. Through what slavery, slaughter, and sacrifice, through what inquisitions and imprisonments, pains and persecutions, black codes and gloomy creeds, the soul of humanity has struggled for centuries, while mercy has veiled her face, and all hearts have been dead alike to love and hope.
In 1866, Anthony and Stanton founded the American Equal Rights Association. And in 1868, they started publishing the newspaper, The Revolution, in Rochester.
The masthead read, "Men their rights and nothing more. Women their rights and nothing less."
Their aim,
Justice for all.
the friendship between Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony was torn apart over the question of including women in the right to vote.
Douglass was convinced that if women were included, the amendment would fail. He had a point.
But the conflict between Douglass and Anthony wasn't the only argument. In 1869, the suffrage movement itself split over a difference in tactics.
The National Women's Suffrage Association, founded by Anthony and Stanton, wanted to continue to campaign for a constitutional amendment. The American Women's Suffrage Association, founded by Lucy Stone, proposed a different strategy, securing the vote state by state.
That local technique began to work. Wyoming became the first territory to give women the vote in 1869. The territory of Utah quickly followed in 1870.
Since the Western territories were so friendly to female voters, Susan B. Anthony toured the West, speaking for women's suffrage.
Then in November 1872, Anthony and a group of other women were arrested in Anthony's hometown of Rochester, New York, for voting in the presidential election.
Well, clearly the goal was to bring attention to the cause.
She refused to pay for her own streetcar ride to the police station.
But the police paid it.
She refused to pay bail and filed for habeas corpus.
But her lawyer posted the bond.
She was convicted and fined $100, but when she refused to pay,
the judge wouldn't imprison her, effectively denying her the right to appeal.
The system might have frustrated her attempt to create the basis for a test case, but the arrest was the basis for one of her most famous speeches.
Friends and fellow citizens, I stand before you tonight under indictment for the alleged crime of having voted in the last presidential election without having a lawful right to vote. It shall be my work this evening to prove to you that in thus voting, I not only committed no crime, but instead simply exercised my citizens' rights guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national Constitution, beyond the power of any state to deny. The preamble of the federal Constitution says,
"We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America."
it was we the people, not we the white male citizens, nor yet we the male citizens, but we the whole people who formed the Union. And we formed it not to give them the blessings of liberty, but to secure them, not to the half of ourselves and the half of our posterity, but to the whole people, women as well as men. And it is downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by this democratic Republican government, the ballot. For any state to make sex a qualification that must ever result in the disfranchisement of one entire half of the people is to pass a bill of attainder or an ex post facto law, and is therefore a violation of the supreme law of the land. By it, the blessings of liberty are forever withheld from women and their female posterity. To them, this government has no just powers derived from the consent of the governed. To them, this government is not a democracy. It is not a republic. It is an odious aristocracy, a hateful oligarchy of sex, the most hateful aristocracy ever established on the face of the globe, an oligarchy of wealth where the rich govern the poor, an oligarchy of learning where the educated govern the ignorant, or even an oligarchy of race where the Saxon rules the African might be endured. But this oligarchy of sex, which makes fathers, brothers, husbands, sons, the oligarchs over the mother and sisters, the wives and daughters of every household, which ordains all men sovereigns, all women subjects, carries dissension, discord, and rebellion into every home in the nation. Webster, Worcester, and Bouvier all define a citizen to be a person of the United States, entitled to vote and hold office. The only question left to be settled now is, are women persons? And I hardly believe any of our opponents will have the hardihood to say they are not. Being persons, then, women are citizens, and no state has the right to make any law or enforce any old law that shall abridge their privileges or immunities. Hence, every discrimination against women in the constitutions and laws of the several states is today null and void, precisely as is everyone against Negroes.
In January of 1878, a 16th Amendment, just as Mrs. Stanton had envisioned, was introduced in the United States Senate.
Senator Aaron Sargent from California introduced Senate Resolution 12, also known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment.
By June of 1878, the Committee on Privileges and Elections had reviewed 30,000 petitions requesting a woman's suffrage amendment.
Their recommendation? That consideration of the issue be indefinitely postponed.
In June of 1882, a Senate committee submitted a report which recommended that the entire body take up a woman's suffrage amendment.
5 years later, a vote was actually taken. The amendment was defeated 16-34.
In 1890, the two factions of the American suffrage movement reconciled as the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was elected its first president. But in the wings, a new generation of women suffragists stood ready to take up the cause.
Wait, are they suffragists or suffragettes?
Well, that would depend.
Depend on what?
Suffragists believed in peaceful protest, and suffragettes did not. Actually, deeds, not words, was their motto.
Although you would have to say that they used words to great effect. The word suffragette, for example. Suffrage refers to the right to vote.
And "et" is the French suffix for something small.
Right. So a cigarette would be
A small cigar.
roulette.
A small wheel.
But the same suffix might indicate a female.
So a jockette would be
Female jockey.
a hackette.
A female newspaper writer.
Or it might indicate that something was imitation or inferior.
Leatherette.
Fake leather.
So, "et" is something that you can tack on to the end of a word to indicate something tiny or womanly or inferior.
When the women's movement shifted from petitions and editorials to breaking windows and stuffing bombs in mailboxes, newspapermen coined the word suffragette to describe these hysterical agitators and violent cranks.
Back in Great Britain, Emmeline Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union, Mrs. Pankhurst was a great believer in direct action and civil disobedience. Remember, deeds, not words. But she embraced the term suffragette, daring men not to take her seriously.
Then a young American woman, a college graduate named Alice Paul, came to England in 1908 to study social work. She arrived just in time to join Pankhurst in her deeds. Pankhurst and Paul, and scores of other women, were arrested repeatedly. And the conditions at Holloway Prison, where the women were incarcerated, were terrible. In fact, Alice Paul actually invented the hunger strike while she was there as a protest.
Concerned that one of these solidly middle-class women would actually die in custody, police and politicians responded, and not gently. Paul described what happened next.
Each day I was wrapped in blankets and taken to another cell to be fed, the food being injected through my nostrils. During this operation, the largest wardess in Holloway sat astride my knees, holding my shoulders to keep me from leaning forward. 2 other wardesses sat on either side and held my arms, and then a towel was placed around my throat, and one doctor from behind held my head, while the other doctor put a tube in my nostril, and when it reached my throat, my head was pushed forward. Twice the tube came through my mouth, and I got it between my teeth. My mouth was pried open with an instrument. Sometimes they tied me to the chair with sheets. Once I managed to get my hands loose and snatched the tube, tearing it with my teeth. I also broke a jug, but I didn't give in.
When Paul returned home to America, naturally she joined the American women's movement. But the genteel ways of NASA frustrated her. So she created her own movement, the National Woman's Party.
The National Women's Party was ready to petition, to picket, and even parade in support of suffrage. When permits were denied, she simply told her supporters to take their placards and march alongside those who had been granted permits.
She shadowed every major political and public event, converting even holidays into demonstration opportunities, events. Her first, and the largest, was a parade in support of suffrage held in Washington, D.C. on March 3, 1913, the day before President-elect Woodrow Wilson's inauguration.
Supporters of suffrage from across the country descended on the nation's capital. Among the marchers was a delegation from Illinois. That delegation included Ida B. Wells, the crusading African-American journalist. Wells had written persuasively about the lynchings in the South, exposing it as an intimidation tactic and not the local justice that practitioners claimed it to be. She and her friend Belle Squire had founded the Alpha Suffrage Club, which was designed to foster civic engagement by Black women in Chicago.
Just hours before the parade was to begin, Wells was told by the parade organizers that she should march at the end of the parade in the segregated section for colored women. Washington, D.C., she was told, was a segregated city, and the parade needed to respect that.
At first, Wells seemed to comply, but when the approximately 8,000 women began their march, complete with banners and floats down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House, Ida B. Wells merely slipped into the Illinois delegation and linked arms with her white colleague Belle Squire and proceeded to walk the parade route.
An estimated 500,000 spectators watched, either supporting or harassing the marchers. For many, the 1913 parade marked the beginning of a new chapter in the women's suffrage movement.
For Ida B. Wells, it was yet another opportunity to live her own personal motto.
One had better die fighting against injustice than die like a dog or a rat in a trap.
In March of 1914, A second Senate vote on suffrage was held. This time the vote was 35-34 in favor of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, 11 votes short of the required two-thirds majority.
On March 17th, Paul and other suffragists met with Wilson, who said it was not yet time for an amendment to the Constitution.
On April 7th, Paul organized a demonstration and founded her new group, the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, to focus specifically on lobbying Congress.
Not to be outdone, the National American Women's Suffrage Association responds by holding the first of its annual Women's Suffrage Days.
Although Susan B. Anthony had died in 1906, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment stayed in the public eye. Belle La Follette, the wife of Wisconsin Senator Robert La Follette, was sworn in and testified before the Senate.
America is a country of, by, and for the people. Are not women people?
Women across the country had never stopped lobbying state legislatures for the right to vote.
By 1916, women could vote in 12 Western states. The local approach had seemed to work, but then it stalled.
In January of 1917, Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated for a second term.
This time, Alice Paul and other members of the National Women's Party took up posts outside each of the 6 entrances to the White House, protesting silently with signs that read,
Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?
Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?
The women kept up their watch day after day in all kinds of weather, earning their nickname of the Silent Sentinels.
We shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments.
Of course, President Woodrow Wilson was speaking of America's involvement in World War I, but that did not stop the suffragists from declaring,
We shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments.
The time has come to conquer or submit. For us, there can be but one choice. We have made it.
The time has come to conquer or submit. For us, there can be but one choice. We have made it.
Liberty is the fundamental demand of the human spirit.
Mr. President, you say liberty is the fundamental demand of the human spirit?
Politically speaking, in the United States, we are interested in nothing but liberty.
Mr. President, you say we are interested in the United States, politically speaking, in nothing but human liberty.
Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye.
Mr. President, it is unjust to deny women a voice in their government when that government is conscripting their sons.
Daily, the Sentinels were heckled and taunted. When a group of young men actually attacked the picketers, the police moved in and arrested the women for obstructing traffic.
Once again, Alice Paul was arrested. She was convicted and sentenced to 7 months in the district jail. As it had been at Holloway Prison 10 years before, the food was often rotten and infested. To protest against these horrible conditions, Paul began another hunger strike. The police response was to move her to the prison's psychiatric unit, where again they force-fed her. This time, it was raw eggs through a feeding tube.
It seems unthinkable now, doesn't it? It was shocking that a government of men could look with such extreme contempt on a movement that was asking nothing except such a small little thing as the right to vote.
For 2.5 years, from January 10th, 1917 through June 4th, 1919, the silent sentinels held their vigils 6 days a week. In all, over 2,000 women held placards and stood silently at one of the 6 gates to the White House or in Lafayette Park. The picketers were harassed, arrested, incarcerated, beaten, and even tortured.
Appalled by the brutality against the protesters he had watched from the White House windows, President Wilson finally changed his mind in September of 1918.
We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right?
Despite the president's support, in November of 1918, the proposed amendment came up 2 votes short, 53 to 31.
In February of 1919, the amendment came up 1 vote short, 55 to 29.
On May 21st, 1919, U.S. Representative James R. Mann, a Republican from Illinois and chairman of the Suffrage Committee, proposed the House resolution to approve the Susan Anthony Amendment, granting women the right to vote. The measure passed the House 304 to 89, a full 42 votes above the required 2/3 majority.
2 weeks later, on June 4th, 1919, the U.S. Senate passed the 19th Amendment by 2 votes over its 2/3 required majority, 56 to 25.
The silent sentinels took their placards and went home.
And then the 19th Amendment was sent to the states for ratification.
Harry Chapman Catt, one of the architects of the original state-by-state coordinated suffrage campaign, traveled the country urging ratification.
Within 6 days of the beginning of the ratification cycle, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin each ratified the amendment.
Kansas, New York, and Ohio followed on June 16, 1919.
By March of the following year, a total of 35 states had approved the amendment, 1 state shy of the 2/3 required for ratification.
Southern states were adamantly opposed to the amendment. 7 of them, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Maryland, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia, had already rejected it.
3 states had refused to even consider the issue.
Then, the Tennessee General Assembly agreed to take up the question.
Proponents and opponents of women's suffrage walked the halls of the state capitol, distributing roses, yellow for the pros and red for the antis.
Tennessee's state legislators were split 48 to 48. 3 times the decision came down to Harry T. Byrne, a 23-year-old Republican representative from McMinn County.
Twice, he moved to have the matter tabled.
Now, originally Byrne was for the amendment, but when party regulars told him that his constituents were overwhelmingly against it, he changed his vote. Then he got a letter from his mother.
Dear son, hurrah, vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt. I noticed Chandler's speech. It was very bitter. I've been watching to see how you stood, but I have not seen anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Thomas Cat with her rats. She is the one who put rat in ratification. No more from Mama this time. With lots of love, Mama.
Harry Burns voted aye.
The 19th Amendment was fully ratified.
After the anti-suffragists attacked him and attacked his integrity and honor, Byrne inserted a personal statement in the House Journal. He explained his decision to cast the vote, in part because I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification.
On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was certified by U.S. Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby.
Women had finally achieved the long-sought right to vote throughout the United States. There were 20 million newly enfranchised American women voters.
On November 2nd of that same year, more than 8 million women across the U.S. voted in elections for the first time.
Black women, like Black men, had to wait until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 before they had the opportunity to vote without obstruction.
It took the remaining 12 states over 60 years to ratify the 19th Amendment.
Mississippi was the last to do so on March 22nd, 1984.
The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
On August 26, 1920, Carrie Chapman Catt, twice president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the first president of the League of Women Voters, celebrated the victory with these words.
The vote is the emblem of your equality. Women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. That vote of yours has cost millions of dollars and the lives of thousands of women. Money to carry on this work has been given, usually as a sacrifice. And thousands of women have gone without things they wanted and could have had in order that they might help get the vote for you. Women have suffered agony of soul, which you can never comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it. The vote is a power, a weapon of offense and defense, a prayer. Understand what it means and what it can do for your country. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. No soldier in the great suffrage army has labored and suffered to get a place for you. Their motive has been the hope that women would aim higher than their own selfish ambitions, that they would serve the common good. The vote is won. 72 years the battle for this privilege has been waged, but human affairs with their eternal change move on without pause. Progress is calling to you to make no pause. Act.
Act.